Hey there, welcome back to LURK. And if this is your first night with us, there's always a place for you here. Tonight, we're leaving the noise of the world behind. No notifications, no deadlines, no reason to stay awake. Just you, the darkness, and a collection of stories that become more unsettling the longer you listen. There may be a few ads during the opening minutes to keep LURK running. After that, the rest of the night is completely ad-free, so you can close your eyes and let the stories carry you towards sleep. If you enjoy these late-night journeys, subscribe to LURK and come back tomorrow night. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Now, turn down the lights. Get comfortable. Pull your chair a little closer. And remember, the people in tonight's stories were not looking for anything terrifying. They were simply trying to get through an ordinary night, until something found them. I was on a backwoods backpacking trip with some friends when we came across something that still sticks with me years later. We had been hiking through a remote area, far enough from the usual trails and campsites that we weren't expecting to run into many people. The whole point of the trip was to get away from everything. No busy roads, no crowds, no houses, just miles of woods, our backpacks, and the people we had come with. We had been walking for quite a while when we noticed something through the trees. At first, I couldn't tell exactly what it was. It looked like some kind of small structure hidden back in the woods. We weren't sure if it was a cabin, an old hunting shelter, or maybe just part of some abandoned property. Naturally, we became curious. When you're backpacking in the middle of nowhere, finding something that doesn't seem like it belongs there immediately gets your attention. We changed direction slightly and walked toward it. As we got closer, we realized it was an old cabin. Calling it a cabin almost made it sound nicer than it actually was. It was extremely makeshift. The whole thing looked like it had been thrown together with whatever materials someone could find. The wood was old and weathered. Parts of the structure looked like they were slowly falling apart. There was nothing about it that suggested anyone had been taking care of it for a long time. The roof looked rough. The walls had clearly seen better days. The entire place had that abandoned look where nature had started taking it back. Plants were growing around the structure, and the woods seemed to be slowly closing in around it. We stopped outside and looked at it for a while. There was no obvious sign that anyone was currently living there. No vehicle, no fresh footprints, no smoke, no voices, no recently cut firewood. Nothing that made us think someone was staying there at the time. Still, we were careful. Finding an abandoned-looking cabin in the middle of nowhere isn't necessarily a good reason to assume it's completely empty. Someone could have been using it occasionally. It could have belonged to a hunter. It could have been an old shelter. It could have been someone's private property. We didn't want to cause trouble. So we mostly stayed outside and looked around. The first thing that really caught our attention was the stuff scattered around the cabin. There were several old food tins. They were the kind of things you could imagine someone carrying into the woods years ago because they needed something simple and easy to store. Some were rusty. Some were partly buried. They looked like they had been sitting there for a very long time. There were also broken whiskey bottles, several of them. They were scattered around the area near the cabin. Some were just pieces of glass. Others were still recognizable as old bottles, but they were dirty and weathered. That immediately gave the place a different feeling. It wasn't necessarily scary, at least not yet. It just made us wonder about whoever had been there. Someone had apparently spent enough time at that location to eat meals there and drink whiskey there. But how long ago? And why had they been living in such a rough shelter? We started joking about it. Maybe it had been an old hunter's cabin. Maybe some guy used to disappear into the woods for weeks at a time. Maybe it had been a temporary camp for someone working in the area. There were plenty of ordinary explanations. Nothing about the cabin itself proved anything strange had happened there. Then, we walked around the back. That's when we noticed the cross. It was easy to miss at first. It wasn't a large, polished monument. It was just a simple cross made from wood. But it looked hand-carved. Someone had clearly taken the time to make it. And the way it was positioned made it look like it had once been used as a grave marker. We stopped talking. I remember the atmosphere changing almost immediately. It wasn't because we suddenly knew someone had died there. We didn't. It could have been anything. The cross might have marked a grave. It might have been something religious. It might have been placed there for another reason entirely. But seeing it behind that abandoned cabin made the whole place feel different. A cabin by itself is interesting. A cabin with old food tins and whiskey bottles is interesting. A cabin with a handmade cross that appears to be a grave marker makes you start asking questions. Who had lived there? Who had died there? Why was the grave so far from everything? How long had it been there, and why had the cabin been abandoned? We stood there looking at it. Nobody immediately wanted to get closer. There was something about the cross that made the whole situation feel more personal. The cabin wasn't just an abandoned structure anymore. It looked like there had been a person here. Maybe someone had lived here. Maybe someone had died here. Maybe someone had buried a friend or family member behind the cabin. Maybe the person who had been living there had eventually disappeared and left everything behind. We didn't know. And because we didn't know, our imagination started filling in the gaps. That's one of the strange things about finding abandoned places. The evidence is always incomplete. You see a few objects, but you don't know the story behind them. You see an old bottle, but you don't know who drank from it. You see an old food tin, but you don't know who opened it. You see a cross, but you don't know who it was meant to remember. Your brain naturally starts creating a story. We tried not to do that. At least, we tried. We were there to backpack, not investigate an abandoned cabin. We weren't ghost hunters. We weren't looking for some supernatural experience. We were just a group of friends who had found something interesting in the woods. Still, it was hard not to wonder. We looked around the area more carefully. There were no obvious recent signs of activity, no fresh garbage, no new bottles, no recent footprints that we could clearly identify. Nothing that suggested someone had been there recently. The cabin seemed genuinely abandoned. The cross also looked old. The wood had weathered over time. It wasn't something that looked freshly made. Everything seemed to belong to the same forgotten period. Whoever had been there was long gone. That thought should have made us feel better. Instead, it made the place feel even stranger. There was something unsettling about seeing the remains of someone's life sitting quietly in the woods, especially when you had no idea where they had gone. The surrounding forest was incredibly quiet. We had been hiking for hours, so we were used to the natural sounds around us. Birds, wind, branches moving, our own footsteps. But standing near the cabin, we became much more aware of every little sound. The old wood creaked occasionally. Leaves moved when the wind passed through. Somewhere in the distance, something made a noise in the forest. Nothing unusual. But once you become interested in a place, you start noticing everything. One of my friends suggested that maybe the cross really was a grave marker. Another wondered if there was actually a grave underneath it. We didn't dig. We didn't disturb anything. There was no reason to. Whatever had happened there wasn't ours to interfere with. We simply looked. The more we thought about the place, the more questions came up. If there had been a grave, Who was buried there? Was it someone who had lived in the cabin? Was it a family member? A friend? A stranger? Someone who died accidentally? Someone who got sick? Someone who simply couldn't make it out of the wilderness? The old food tin suggested whoever had been there had spent enough time in the cabin to need supplies. The whiskey bottles suggested they had also spent time drinking. That could mean absolutely nothing. People drink. Hunters drink. Workers drink. Travelers drink. There was nothing inherently strange about it. But when you put all the pieces together, the place felt like the remains of a life that had been completely forgotten. And that was what bothered me most. The forest had swallowed almost everything. The cabin was falling apart. The bottles were broken. The food tins were rusting. The cross was weathered. There was no sign explaining what had happened. It was as though whoever had been there had simply disappeared from the world, leaving a few objects behind. We started wondering how old the cabin actually was. None of us had any way to determine it. The construction wasn't professional. It looked more like something someone had built because they needed shelter. Maybe it was never meant to last. Maybe the person who built it only planned to stay there for a season. Maybe they were hiding from civilization. Maybe they were simply someone who preferred living in the woods. There were too many possibilities, and none of them could be confirmed. Eventually, we decided we had seen enough. We didn't want to spend the rest of the day exploring the place. We still had miles to cover. We had a route to follow and a place where we planned to camp later. So we started gathering our backpacks and preparing to leave. Before we left, I looked back at the cabin. It was strange how quickly it had gone from being an interesting discovery to a place I didn't really want to stay around. Nothing had happened. Nobody had appeared. We hadn't heard a voice. We hadn't seen anything supernatural. There wasn't even evidence that anyone had been there recently. Yet I still felt relieved when we started walking away. Maybe it was simply because abandoned places make people uncomfortable. Maybe it was because of the cross. Maybe it was because we were deep in the woods and didn't know the history of the location. Or maybe it was because there was something about the place that we couldn't quite identify. We never found out. We continued our hike. After a while, the cabin disappeared behind the trees. The forest looked normal again. The farther we got, the less we thought about it. We talked about other things. The trail, our food, where we would stop for the night. The usual stuff. But the image of that handmade cross stayed in my mind. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't covered in strange symbols. It wasn't some giant monument. It was just a simple wooden cross. That somehow made it more unsettling. Someone had made it. Someone had carried the pieces of wood there. Someone had put it together. Someone had decided that a person buried there deserved a marker. And then, at some point, everyone left. The woods remained, the cabin remained, the bottles remained, the food tins remained, and the cross remained. Years later, I still wonder about that place. I've tried to imagine what the story behind it might have been. Maybe the simplest explanation is the correct one. An old hunter built a rough cabin. He spent time there. He brought food and whiskey. At some point, someone died nearby. He made a simple cross for the grave. Eventually, the cabin was abandoned. Nature took over. That's completely possible. In fact, it's probably more likely than anything supernatural. But there are still details that make me curious. Why was the cabin so far back in the woods? Why was it so poorly built? Why did it look like it had been abandoned for so long? Who was buried behind it? And why did nobody come back? Those are questions I will probably never have answers to. The thing about finding something like that while backpacking is that you're only seeing the final chapter. You're walking through a place where someone else once lived, worked, struggled, or possibly died. You don't know what happened before you arrived. You only see what's left. A broken bottle, an old food tin, a piece of wood, a cross. And sometimes that's enough to make your imagination do the rest. I think that's why the cabin stayed with me. It wasn't necessarily frightening in the moment. It was unsettling. There is a difference. Fear tells you something is happening right now. Uneasiness tells you that something happened here before you arrived. And you don't know what it was. That's exactly how that cabin felt. Like we had walked into the remains of a story that had ended a long time ago. We were never supposed to know how it ended. We were simply passing through. I sometimes wonder if the cabin is still there. It was already in terrible condition when we found it. The roof was old. The walls were weathered. The forest was beginning to reclaim the area. After all these years, I imagine it may have completely collapsed. Maybe the trees have grown over it. Maybe the old food tins are still lying somewhere beneath the leaves. Maybe the broken whiskey bottles are still scattered around the ground. And maybe that handmade cross is still standing. Or maybe it finally fell over. Maybe the wood rotted away. Maybe nobody has seen the place in years. There is something strangely sad about that thought. If there really was a grave there, then someone once cared enough to mark it. They made that cross by hand. They placed it there so the person wouldn't simply disappear without a trace. But eventually, even the marker would disappear. The woods don't care about human memories. They grow over everything. Buildings, trails, campsites, graves. Eventually, time erases almost everything. That may be what happened there. We were just lucky enough to pass through before it was completely gone. I remember one of my friends making a joke about the cabin after we left. Something about whoever had lived there being the kind of person who wanted to disappear from civilization. We laughed. It was easier to joke about it once we were away. But nobody suggested going back. Nobody said we should return and explore it more. Nobody wanted to make a second trip to that cabin. That says something. We had been curious when we first saw it. Once we saw the cross, our curiosity changed. We didn't want to know everything anymore. Sometimes knowing that something happened is enough. You don't necessarily need to know every detail, especially when the details might be disturbing. I still remember the way the cabin looked through the trees. It was small, rough, almost swallowed by the forest. It didn't look like a place where anyone had lived recently. It looked forgotten. And then there was the cross behind it. Simple, handmade, weathered, standing there quietly. That image has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that backpacking trip. Not because something jumped out at us. Not because we were chased. Not because we heard voices. Nothing like that happened. The cabin simply existed. And that was enough. There are places in the wilderness that make you feel like you're the first person to ever see them. Then there are places that make you feel like you're seeing something you're not supposed to see. That cabin was somewhere in between. It was clearly abandoned. But it also felt like someone had left something behind. A piece of their life. Maybe more than one person's life. The old food tins told us someone had eaten there. The whiskey bottles told us someone had spent evenings there. The cross suggested that someone had died there or nearby. But we couldn't connect those pieces. We couldn't turn them into a complete story. So the mystery remained. Maybe that's why I still think about it. Years have passed, but I can still picture us standing behind the cabin. Looking at that cross, looking at the old bottles, looking at the rusted food tins, trying to imagine who had once lived there, and wondering why they had left. I don't know if the place was ever haunted. I don't know if anything supernatural happened there. I never saw a ghost. I never heard a voice. I never experienced anything that I could honestly call paranormal. All I know is what we found. An old makeshift cabin deep in the woods. No obvious sign that anyone had been there for a long time. Several old food tins, broken whiskey bottles, and a hand-carved wooden cross that looked like it had once marked a grave. That's it. But sometimes that's enough. Because when you're miles from civilization, standing beside a forgotten cabin in the middle of the woods, you can't help wondering about the person who stood there before you. What did they see? What did they hear? Who were they waiting for? Who did they bury? What happened to them? And why did they leave the cabin behind? We will probably never know. Maybe that's better. Maybe some places are meant to be discovered, looked at for a few minutes, and then left exactly as you found them. That's what we did. We didn't touch the cross. We didn't disturb the possible grave. We didn't take anything from the cabin. We didn't try to break into it or search through someone's old belongings. We simply looked. Then we picked up our backpacks and continued down the trail. As the cabin disappeared behind us, I remember feeling relieved. The woods ahead looked completely normal. The trail continued. The trees moved gently in the wind. Everything was peaceful again. But I kept thinking about that cross, a simple piece of carved wood standing behind a collapsing cabin. Someone had put it there for a reason. Someone had cared enough to make it. And whatever story belonged to that place had ended long before we arrived. We were just passing through. And maybe that's the creepiest part of all. We found the remains of a life in the middle of nowhere. We saw the evidence that someone had once eaten there, drank there, lived there, and possibly buried someone there. But there was nobody left to tell us what happened. Only the cabin, only the old bottles, only the rusted tins, and that lonely hand-carved cross standing behind it. We left it all exactly where we found it. And to this day, I still wonder who was buried there. I was once lucky enough to experience something in downtown Chicago that I still think about years later. It wasn't a paranormal experience. At least, I don't think it was. Nothing appeared in front of me. Nobody chased me. There were no strange figures, no voices, and no obvious explanation for what I was seeing. But for about 3 minutes, I experienced something that felt completely impossible. I was standing outside Union Station in Chicago at around 7 in the morning. It was a beautiful morning. The sun was already shining. The sky was clear, and there was nothing about the weather that suggested anything unusual. It should have been one of the busiest places imaginable. Chicago, downtown, near Union Station. 7 in the morning, that should mean people everywhere. Cars moving through the streets, taxis, buses, workers heading into buildings, people carrying coffee, delivery trucks, construction crews, commuters rushing toward trains, the usual morning chaos of a major American city. But that morning, there was none of it. Not a single person. Not a single car. And almost no sound. I remember standing there and looking down the street because I honestly couldn't understand what I was seeing. The block was empty. Completely empty. At first, I thought maybe I had somehow ended up on the wrong street. Maybe this particular block was closed. Maybe it was a holiday. Maybe something had happened that I hadn't heard about. Maybe I was simply too early. But the longer I stood there, the stranger it became. There was nothing. No traffic, no pedestrians, no conversations, no horns, no engines, no footsteps, no sirens in the distance. Nothing that sounded like a normal city. It was just this enormous urban environment sitting completely still in the morning sunlight. And that's what made it so strange. It wasn't dark. It wasn't raining. There wasn't a power outage. There wasn't a disaster. There wasn't fog covering the streets. Everything was bright and visible. The buildings were standing exactly where they were supposed to be. The sun was shining between them. The streets were clean and perfectly normal. But the people were gone. The cars were gone. The noise was gone. It looked like Chicago had simply stopped. I started walking. I don't remember deciding to do it. I just started moving down the block. And as I walked, I became more aware of how unnatural the silence felt. You don't realize how much background noise exists in a city until it's suddenly missing. Normally, you don't even think about it. There's always something. A car accelerating. A bus braking. Someone talking. A truck unloading something. A door opening. A train somewhere in the distance. A siren. A horn. Footsteps. Even when you're not consciously listening, your brain is constantly processing all of those sounds. That morning, it had almost nothing to process. And that made the silence feel enormous. I could hear my own footsteps. That was one of the first things that really got to me. My shoes hitting the pavement sounded much louder than they should have. Every step seemed to echo through the empty space. I could hear myself breathing. I could hear the movement of my clothes. And every time I looked around, there was still nobody there. The sun was shining. The buildings were towering over me. But the streets looked abandoned. Not abandoned in the normal sense. There were no boarded-up windows, no empty buildings, no trash blowing around, no signs of a city that had been deserted. It was more like the entire population had vanished for a few minutes. That distinction made it much creepier. If I had walked through a deserted industrial area, I wouldn't have thought much of it. But this was downtown Chicago, near Union Station, at a time when people should have been everywhere. I remember looking down one street and seeing nothing but pavement and buildings. Then I looked down another. Nothing. I kept expecting someone to appear. A person walking around the corner. A car turning onto the street. A delivery truck. Anything. Nothing happened. For a moment, I started wondering if I had somehow entered a completely different version of the city. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but that's genuinely what it felt like. Like I had walked into Chicago after everyone had disappeared. The strangest part was that I wasn't exactly scared. I was fascinated. There was definitely an eerie feeling. My instincts were telling me that something wasn't right. But at the same time, I was amazed by what I was seeing. I had never seen a major city look like that before, and I haven't since. It felt almost like I had been given access to a version of the city that nobody else was supposed to see. A completely silent Chicago. No traffic, no crowds, no rushing commuters. Just buildings, sunlight, and empty streets. I remember thinking that if someone had told me I was walking through a movie set, I would have believed them. It looked staged. It looked too perfect. The sunlight was shining between the buildings. The streets were completely open. Everything was exactly where it should be. There was simply nobody there. And because there was nobody there, the city suddenly seemed enormous. Normally, people make cities feel smaller. Crowds fill the spaces between buildings. Cars move through the streets. People give scale to everything. Without them, the buildings seemed massive. The streets seemed wider. The sidewalks seemed longer. The distance between one building and another seemed greater. It was almost as if removing people had changed the physical size of the city. I kept walking. I didn't rush. I wanted to experience it. I knew even while it was happening that it was something I would probably remember for the rest of my life. There are moments when you realize you're experiencing something unusual while you're still inside the moment. This was one of them. I knew it wasn't normal. I knew I was going to remember it. So, I kept walking. The whole time, I kept expecting the silence to break. But it didn't. For about 3 minutes, I had the entire block to myself. 3 minutes doesn't sound like much. But when you're standing in one of the busiest cities in America, and there isn't a single person or vehicle around you, 3 minutes feels much longer. Time seemed strange. Everything felt slowed down. There was no traffic telling me how quickly the morning was moving. No crowd, no conversation, no movement, just sunlight, buildings, empty streets, and my footsteps. It reminded me of those scenes in movies where the main character wakes up and discovers that everyone else has disappeared. Except this wasn't a movie. I was actually there. And I was completely alone. I remember looking toward Union Station. The idea that there could be thousands of people nearby, but none visible from where I was standing, made the experience even stranger. It wasn't like I was in the middle of nowhere. I was in the center of a huge American city. Civilization was all around me. But for those few minutes, it was as if civilization had been switched off. I didn't know whether I should laugh or be nervous, so I did both. I remember thinking how unbelievably cool it was. At the same time, there was this little voice in my head saying, "This isn't right. Keep moving." And that's what I did. I continued walking. I kept looking around. Every few seconds, I expected someone to appear. Nothing. The silence was so complete that I became hyper-aware of everything around me. The shape of the buildings, the shadows on the pavement, the sunlight hitting the windows, the sound of my shoes. Even the air felt different. Normally, you don't notice the air in a city. There's always movement. Cars push air around. People move past you. Doors open. Buildings release warm air. Traffic creates constant motion. That morning, everything seemed still. It was like the city was holding its breath. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. I walked into the station. And suddenly, chaos. People everywhere. Noise everywhere. Movement everywhere. It was like I had stepped through an invisible wall. One moment, I was walking through an empty city. The next, I was surrounded by people. Cars were moving through the streets. People were walking in every direction. The normal sounds of Chicago were back. Traffic. Voices, footsteps, engines, doors, announcements, everything. I remember being almost stunned by how quickly it changed. There was no gradual return. It wasn't like I saw one person, then 2 cars, then a few more people. It was as if the entire city had suddenly switched back on. Cars and people poured into the streets. The silence was gone. The emptiness was gone. Everything was normal again. And that made the previous 3 minutes feel even stranger. Because once the city became busy again, I could finally appreciate just how abnormal that empty stretch had been. I stood there for a moment, looking back toward the street. People were moving everywhere. Cars were passing. The city was alive again. And I remember thinking, did that really just happen? Of course it did. I had just walked through it. But the contrast was so extreme that it almost felt like I had imagined the whole thing. I hadn't. I knew what I had seen. I had been there. I had walked down that empty block. I had heard almost nothing. And then I had walked inside and suddenly found myself surrounded by the normal chaos of downtown Chicago. I've heard people describe eerie experiences as feeling like the world was wrong. That is exactly how this felt. Nothing was visibly wrong. Everything looked normal. But the absence of people, changed everything. It's strange how much of our sense of safety comes from simply knowing that other people are around. When you see people walking down the street, you don't think about it. You don't consciously register every person. But your brain knows they're there. They are proof that the environment is functioning normally. That morning, I had none of that reassurance. There was no one. And because there was no one, every possibility felt slightly more unsettling. What if something had happened? What if I had missed some kind of emergency? What if the streets had been closed? What if everyone had been told to stay inside? What if there was some reason I didn't know about? I didn't have answers. I only knew that I was standing in a completely empty downtown area on a bright morning. And honestly, that's what made it so fascinating. It wasn't horror in the traditional sense. It was something much stranger. It was the experience of seeing something completely ordinary become completely unfamiliar. Chicago was still Chicago. The buildings were still there. The roads were still there. The station was still there. But without the people, it looked like something else. It looked like a ghost city. For those few minutes, I felt like I was the ghost. I was walking through a place that was normally packed with life, but nobody could see me because there was nobody there. I felt like I was wandering through the remains of a city that had already died. And yet, everything was beautiful. The sunlight, the architecture, the open streets, the quiet. That's why I say I was blessed to experience it. It was creepy. Absolutely. But it was also incredible. There's something almost magical about seeing a huge city completely stripped of its normal noise. You get to see it in a way that almost nobody ever does. A city without traffic. A city without crowds. A city without the constant movement that normally defines it. Just the physical city itself. Buildings, streets, light, space, silence. For a few minutes, I wasn't experiencing Chicago the way millions of people normally do. I was experiencing it as if I were the only person left. And strangely enough, I loved it. I was scared, but I was also fascinated. It felt like discovering a secret version of a place I'd already known. The memory has stayed with me because I don't think I'll ever experience exactly the same thing again. Cities don't usually go silent, especially not downtown Chicago on a sunny morning. That's why the moment felt so unreal. It was one of those rare situations where you don't need anything supernatural to feel like you've stepped into another world. You just need the right place, the right time, and the sudden absence of everything you normally expect. I don't know exactly why that particular block was empty. There could have been a completely ordinary explanation. Maybe traffic patterns had temporarily changed. Maybe people were concentrated somewhere else. Maybe there was some event or delay. Maybe it was simply an incredible coincidence. I'm not claiming that something paranormal happened. I don't know what caused it. All I know is what I experienced. For roughly 3 minutes, I was outside Union Station in downtown Chicago on a bright, beautiful morning. And there wasn't a single car or person on the block. There were no voices, no horns, no engines, no footsteps except mine. Nothing, just silence. I walked the block slowly, almost afraid that if I moved too quickly, the moment would disappear. And eventually, it did. I walked inside. And suddenly, the city came roaring back to life. People poured into the streets. Cars appeared. Noise filled the air. Everything was normal. But I wasn't quite the same. Because for those few minutes, I had seen something that most people never get to see. I had seen a major American city without its people. And it was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. I still remember that feeling. The feeling of walking through downtown Chicago while the entire city seemed to be empty. The feeling of being completely alone while surrounded by enormous buildings. The feeling that something impossible had happened, even though nothing supernatural had actually occurred. And most of all, I remember thinking, this is freaking cool. It was scary, it was eerie, it was completely unnatural. But it was also one of the coolest things I've ever experienced. For 3 minutes, Chicago looked like a dead city, and I felt like a ghost walking through it. Then I stepped inside Union Station, and the living world came rushing back. My mother grew up on a farm that had always felt strange to her. She never really had a good explanation for it. It was an old property, the kind of place that seemed to carry its own atmosphere. There were old buildings scattered around the land, some of them dating back generations. There were barns, sheds, and other structures that had been standing there for so long that nobody in the family could remember exactly when they had been built. When my mother was young, none of that seemed especially unusual. Old farms were like that. They creaked, they settled, they made strange noises at night. The wind moved through the trees and around the buildings. The temperature could change quickly. There were plenty of perfectly normal reasons for strange things to happen on a property like that. At least, that's what everyone assumed. But my mother experienced things there that she could never completely explain. One of the things she remembered most clearly was seeing a man's silhouette. She would sometimes catch sight of what looked like a person moving around the property. Not clearly enough to identify, not clearly enough to say exactly who it was, just the dark shape of a man, a figure in the distance. Sometimes it seemed to be standing near one of the old buildings. Other times, she would notice what looked like movement out of the corner of her eye. She would turn toward it. Nothing. There would be no person standing there. No one walking away. No footsteps. No obvious explanation. At the time, she was young. And when you're a child growing up on an old farm, you learn pretty quickly that strange noises and strange shadows are simply part of life. You don't have the experience to understand what is normal and what isn't. You hear something moving outside at night, and you assume it's an animal. You hear a floorboard creak, and you assume someone is walking around. You see something dark between two buildings, and you assume it was a shadow. That's how my mother treated most of the things she experienced. She didn't immediately decide the farm was haunted. She didn't have a reason to. There was no obvious explanation for what she was seeing, but there was also no proof that anything supernatural was happening. Still, there were certain moments that stayed with her. The temperature changes were one of them. She remembered being outside or moving between different parts of the property and suddenly feeling the air change. Sometimes the temperature would drop dramatically in one particular area. It could feel noticeably colder than the surrounding space. Then, just as quickly, the sensation would disappear. There were also other strange things she remembered. Things that didn't make sense at the time. Sounds that seemed to come from empty areas. Movements that she couldn't explain. Small incidents around the old buildings that made her uncomfortable. Nothing was dramatic enough to prove anything. There was never a moment where she could point to something and say, there, that's definitely a ghost. Instead, there were dozens of small experiences. A strange shadow. A sudden cold spot. A sound when nobody was there. A feeling that someone was nearby. And the old farm itself seemed to make those experiences feel more believable. The buildings were old. The property was isolated. There were plenty of dark corners and places where someone could stand without being noticed. At night, the farm could become incredibly quiet. That kind of silence can make even ordinary things feel wrong. A branch snapping somewhere in the darkness sounds different when you're alone. A door moving in the wind sounds different when you can't see what caused it. A shadow moving across a window can make your heart jump before your brain has time to figure out what it was. My mother grew up with all of that. Eventually, though, she left. Life moved on. The farm became part of her childhood rather than the place where she lived every day. Years passed. The strange experiences became memories. She didn't spend her life trying to prove that the property was haunted. She didn't investigate the history. She didn't go searching through old records. For a long time, she simply accepted that strange things had happened there when she was young. Maybe there were explanations. Maybe there weren't. She couldn't say. Then, many years later, she happened to mention some of those experiences to a neighbor. It wasn't some serious paranormal investigation. She wasn't trying to convince anyone of anything. She was simply talking about the farm. She mentioned the strange things that had happened there when she was growing up. The male silhouette, the sudden changes in temperature, the old buildings, the unexplained noises, the feeling that someone was sometimes present when nobody should have been there. The neighbor happened to be a local historian. That detail would turn out to be important. The neighbor knew the area well. They had spent years researching the history of the community. They knew about old families, old properties, old newspaper reports, old events that had happened long before most people living there had ever been born. After hearing my mother's description of the farm, the neighbor became interested. They decided to look into the property's history. Not because they already believed it was haunted. They were simply curious. Maybe there was something in the records that could explain why the farm had always felt strange. They started searching through old newspaper archives. And eventually, they found something. An article from the late 1800s. It described something that had happened on that very property. A man had killed his entire family there. Then he killed himself. That was the history nobody in my mother's family had known about. The strange experiences suddenly had a much darker context. For years, my mother had remembered seeing a man's silhouette around the property. A male figure, a shape that appeared and disappeared. She had felt sudden changes in temperature. She had experienced other unexplained things around the old buildings. And all of those experiences had happened on land where, more than a century earlier, a man had murdered his entire family before taking his own life. There is no way to know whether the two things were connected. That's the part that makes the story so unsettling. Finding the newspaper article doesn't prove that my mother saw a ghost. It doesn't prove that the temperature changes were paranormal. It doesn't prove that the silhouette she saw was the man described in the article. There are countless ordinary explanations for strange experiences. Old buildings can produce strange sounds. Temperature differences can occur naturally. Light and shadow can create shapes that look like people. Peripheral vision is notoriously unreliable. When someone is young, frightened, or unfamiliar with what they're seeing, the brain can turn something ordinary into something much more frightening. All of that is possible. But there is something deeply disturbing about discovering a historical event that matches the atmosphere of a place you already found strange. Imagine growing up somewhere and spending years having unexplained experiences. Imagine seeing what appears to be a man standing somewhere on the property. Imagine feeling sudden cold spots in certain areas. Imagine hearing things when nobody seems to be around. And then, decades later, someone tells you that the land has a documented history of a man murdering his entire family before killing himself. Suddenly, the memories you had pushed into the back of your mind have a completely different feeling. The silhouette isn't just a silhouette anymore. The old buildings aren't just old buildings. The unexplained sounds aren't just noises. Every strange memory gains another layer. My mother had lived there when she was young. She had no reason to know what had happened there in the late 19th century. The newspaper article existed long before she was born. There was no story in the family that she could have consciously remembered. As far as she knew, it was simply an old farm, a place where she grew up, a place where strange things sometimes happened. That's what makes the discovery so difficult to completely dismiss. She wasn't looking for a ghost story. She wasn't trying to connect her experiences to a murder. The connection came later, much later. And it came from someone who had no reason to invent it. The local historian wasn't telling her an old family legend. They found a newspaper article, a historical record, something written down more than 100 years earlier. The article described a terrible event that had taken place on the same property. A family had been killed. The man responsible had then taken his own life. And that was it. There was no neat explanation for what my mother had experienced. There was no final answer. Only a historical fact sitting beside a collection of strange memories. The more I think about stories like this, the more unsettling they become, because they don't have the clean ending you get in a movie. There is no moment where a ghost appears and explains who they are. There is no photograph proving what happened. There is no investigator who arrives and solves the mystery. There is just a person remembering something from childhood. Then, years later, someone discovers that the place had a terrible history. That's all. And somehow, that's enough. Because places hold history whether we know it or not. A house can look completely ordinary while containing memories that nobody alive remembers. A barn can stand for 100 years after the people who built it are gone. A field can look peaceful while something terrible happened there generations earlier. Most of the time, we walk through places without knowing anything about what happened before us. We see an old building. We see trees. We see a road. We see an empty field. We don't see the people who were there decades earlier. We don't hear their conversations. We don't know their arguments. We don't know their tragedies. We don't know who lived there, who died there, or what happened behind those walls. That's what makes old properties so fascinating, and sometimes, apparently, so frightening. My mother never had an explanation for the silhouette. She couldn't tell whether it was a person. She couldn't tell whether it was something paranormal. She couldn't even be completely certain of everything she saw when she was young. Memory changes over time. Childhood memories become less precise. Details disappear. Other details become stronger. But the feeling remains. That's something people often overlook when talking about experiences like this. You may forget exactly what you saw. You may forget the exact location. You may forget what time of day it happened. But you remember how you felt. My mother remembered the feeling of being watched. She remembered the strange cold. She remembered seeing a male figure where nobody should have been. And she remembered that there were other things around the property that never made sense to her. Then, she learned about the murders, and suddenly, those memories felt different. If you had been in her position, would you have reacted differently? Would you have wanted to go back to the property? Would you have wanted to investigate the old buildings? Would you have searched for more information about the man and his family? Or would you have preferred never to know? I'm not sure what I would have done. Part of me would want answers. I'd want to know exactly what happened. I'd want to find the original newspaper article. I'd want to know the names of the people involved. I'd want to know where the house stood at the time. I'd want to know whether the current buildings were the same ones that existed in the late 1800s. I'd want to know whether the man died inside the house. I'd want to know whether the family was buried nearby. I'd want to know everything. But another part of me would probably stop searching. Because sometimes knowing the history of a place doesn't make it less frightening. It makes it worse. Before the discovery, the farm was simply strange. Afterward, it had a story. And not just any story. A story involving an entire family being murdered. A story involving a man who, after killing them, took his own life. A story that happened more than a century ago. A story that somehow seemed to fit the strange atmosphere my mother had remembered all those years. That would be enough for me. I wouldn't need to know anything else. And there's another detail that bothers me. My mother didn't describe seeing a woman. She didn't describe seeing a child. She remembered a male silhouette, just a man's shape. That doesn't prove anything. But knowing what happened there makes that detail difficult to ignore. Imagine standing outside one of those old buildings as a child. The sun is going down. The property is quiet. You look toward one of the structures and notice a man's silhouette. You turn away. You look back. Nothing. You feel cold. You hear something. You wonder if someone is nearby. Then you go inside. Years pass. You grow up. You leave. Life continues. And decades later, you're casually talking to a neighbor about the strange things you remember from that farm. The neighbor happens to be a historian. They search the old records. Then they come back with a newspaper clipping. And suddenly, you discover that the land beneath your childhood memories had been the scene of a family massacre. I can't imagine what that must have felt like. There is something uniquely disturbing about finding out that a place from your childhood has a hidden history. Childhood places are usually connected to comfort. Home, family, safety, memories. You don't expect those places to have something dark buried underneath them. But history doesn't care how we remember a place. Something terrible can happen somewhere, and generations later, the property can become a completely normal home. Children can play there. Families can eat dinner there. People can grow up there. And the people living there might never know. That's what makes the story so unsettling to me. Not necessarily the idea of ghosts, the idea that the past can disappear so completely. The people are gone. The event becomes a paragraph in an old newspaper. The buildings change. The property changes hands. New families move in. And eventually, nobody remembers what happened. Except maybe the place itself. Maybe that's why my mother experienced those strange things. Maybe it wasn't supernatural at all. Maybe the old farm simply had the usual problems of an old property. Maybe shadows looked like people. Maybe cold air moved through the buildings. Maybe animals made strange noises. Maybe childhood imagination filled in the gaps. That explanation is entirely possible. But then there is the other possibility. Maybe some places retain something from what happened there. Maybe certain experiences aren't entirely random. Maybe the silhouette my mother saw wasn't a trick of the light. Maybe the sudden temperature changes weren't simply drafts. Maybe the feeling of being watched wasn't just imagination. Maybe something remained. If that's true, then what exactly remained? Was it the man? Was it the family? Was it something created by the violence itself? Or was it simply an echo of something that happened there? I don't know. And neither does my mother. The newspaper article didn't answer those questions. It only confirmed one thing. Something terrible really happened there. Everything else is speculation. But sometimes one confirmed fact is enough to make every unexplained memory feel different. I've heard people say that old houses remember. Usually, I think that's just a poetic way of describing how history becomes attached to places. But when I think about my mother's childhood home, I'm not quite as dismissive. Because the farm had been there for generations. The buildings had stood through decades of weather. Families had lived there. People had worked there. And somewhere in that long history was a tragedy almost nobody remembered. A man had killed his entire family. Then he killed himself. The story disappeared into history. But my mother grew up on that same land, and while she was there, she saw things she couldn't explain. A man's silhouette, sudden changes in temperature, unusual events around the old buildings, a feeling that something was sometimes present. She didn't know why. She didn't have the historical information needed to make a connection. She simply remembered what happened. Then, years later, the newspaper article appeared. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. That's the question that remains. And honestly, I think that's what makes stories like this scarier than stories where someone sees a ghost clearly. When something is completely explained, the fear disappears. When something is completely proven, at least you know what you're dealing with. But when you have just enough information to make the impossible seem possible, that's when your imagination starts filling in the gaps. My mother doesn't have proof that she saw a ghost. The historian didn't find proof of anything supernatural. They found a newspaper article. That's all. But the article changed the way she remembered the farm. It took all those strange childhood experiences and placed them inside a much darker history. And now, whenever I think about that property, I can't help imagining it the way it might have looked after dark. The old buildings standing quietly, the fields stretching into the distance, the air suddenly becoming cold, a child walking outside, then noticing a shape in the distance, a man standing still, watching, and when she looks again, he's gone. Maybe there was never anyone there. Maybe it was only a shadow. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was the fading light. Or maybe the old farm wasn't as empty as everyone thought. Because sometimes the most frightening thing about an old place isn't what you can see. It's what happened there before anyone thought to look. I was working far up in northern British Columbia, Canada, in a remote oil rig camp surrounded by nothing but wilderness. It was the kind of place where you could look in any direction and see forests stretching farther than you could imagine. There were no busy roads nearby, no neighborhoods, no stores, and no houses scattered around the area. Just the rig camp, the workers, the equipment, and miles of Canadian wilderness. I was working there as a cook. It was a strange job in some ways because the camp itself could be busy and full of people, but the moment you stepped outside, the wilderness seemed to swallow everything. The sounds from the camp disappeared surprisingly quickly. The trees were everywhere. The weather could change quickly, and in the winter, the landscape became almost completely white. This happened one afternoon during one of those quiet winter days. It was around 2 o'clock. I had been inside most of the day, doing the usual work in the kitchen. Nothing unusual had happened. It was just another day at the camp. At some point, I decided to step outside for a cigarette. I went out onto the back deck. There was no reason for me to think anything strange was going to happen. I wasn't looking for wildlife. I wasn't worried about anything. I just wanted a few minutes outside. The weather was cold, but strangely calm. It was one of those winter days when everything seems almost frozen in place. There wasn't much wind. The trees weren't moving. There wasn't much noise coming from the forest. And it was snowing. Not the kind of heavy snowstorm where you can barely see anything. These were big, soft snowflakes. They floated slowly through the air. The whole scene had an almost unreal quality to it. The snowflakes seemed to move in slow motion as they fell. Everything looked quiet and peaceful. I stood there smoking and just stared out into the distance. I wasn't concentrating on anything in particular. I would look toward the forest. Then I'd look down at the deck. Then I'd glance to the left. Then the right. Sometimes I'd look up at the falling snow. It was the kind of mindless staring you do when you're alone and have nothing important to think about. I wasn't expecting to see anything. I wasn't even really paying attention. Then I felt it. Someone was watching me. I can't explain exactly what I mean by that. There wasn't a sound. Nothing moved. I didn't hear branches breaking. I didn't hear footsteps in the snow. There was no growling, no warning, no obvious reason for me to think something was nearby. It was simply a feeling, that unmistakable sensation that something had its attention focused directly on you. I remember feeling slightly uncomfortable. I looked around casually at first. Nothing. I looked toward the trees. Nothing. I glanced behind me toward the camp. Nothing. Then I looked straight ahead. That's when I saw it. The forest was only about 30 feet away from where I was standing. Maybe even less. There was a tree line directly in front of the back deck. And right between two trees, there was a wolf. At first, my brain didn't really process what I was seeing. I just saw an animal sitting there. Then I realized how enormous it was. This wasn't a normal-sized wolf. At least, it didn't look normal to me. The animal was sitting down, but it looked so large that it appeared almost human-sized. If it had stood up, I honestly think it would have looked close to the height of a person. It was massive. The shoulders were huge. The body looked thick and powerful. The head was large, and the distance between us suddenly felt much smaller than it had a second earlier. I just stood there. The cigarette was still in my hand. I don't remember taking another drag. I don't remember moving. I simply stared, and the wolf stared back. Our eyes met. For several seconds, neither of us moved. There was something deeply unsettling about the fact that it wasn't running away. Wild animals usually don't behave like that around people. At least that's what I had always assumed. If an animal sees a human, especially in an area where humans aren't normally around, you expect it to become cautious. You expect it to turn around. You expect it to disappear into the trees. This wolf didn't. It just sat there, watching me, almost like it had been waiting for me to notice it. I remember thinking how strange the entire situation was. There I was, standing on the back deck of an oil camp in the middle of northern British Columbia, smoking a cigarette on a quiet winter afternoon. And 30 feet away, between two trees, was this enormous wolf, just sitting. Watching, the strangest part wasn't even how big it was. It was the look. There was something about its eyes. It didn't look confused. It didn't look frightened. It didn't look like it had accidentally wandered too close to the camp. It looked aware, very aware. It was looking directly at me, almost as if it knew exactly what I was, and exactly what I was doing. For a moment, I had the weirdest thought. It was almost like the wolf was saying, "I see you." Not literally, of course. It wasn't speaking. But that's what the look communicated. I know you're there. And then came the second thought. I could eat you. That thought hit me pretty hard, because suddenly I became aware of just how exposed I was. I was standing outside alone. There was no fence between me and the forest, no building directly around me, no vehicle, no weapon, nothing, just me and an enormous wild animal sitting 30 feet away. I started thinking about how quickly things could go wrong if that animal decided to move. I didn't know how fast a wolf could run. I didn't know how aggressive this particular animal might be. I didn't know if it was alone. There could have been others somewhere behind those trees. That thought made the situation even more uncomfortable. But the wolf didn't move. It just kept watching me. I don't know how long we stood there looking at each other. Maybe it was only a few seconds. Maybe it felt longer because of the adrenaline. Time feels strange when you're suddenly aware that a wild predator is staring directly at you. Everything else seemed to disappear. The falling snow, the camp behind me, the cigarette, the cold. All of it became background noise. There was just me and that wolf. Then I looked away. Only for a moment. It wasn't even a deliberate decision. I glanced to the side. Maybe I looked down. Maybe I looked at the snow. I honestly don't remember. It was probably only a fraction of a second. Then I looked back. The wolf was gone. Completely gone. There was nothing between the trees. No movement. No retreating shape. No sound. Nothing. I stood there staring at the exact spot where it had been sitting. I couldn't believe it. I looked to the left. Then, the right. I searched the tree line. Nothing. The forest looked exactly the way it had before I noticed the animal. Quiet, still, snow falling gently through the branches. It was as though the wolf had never been there. For some reason, that bothered me more than if I had watched it walk away. If I'd seen it turn around and disappear into the forest, that would have made sense. But I hadn't. 1 second it was there. I looked away. Then, it wasn't. I stayed outside for another moment, trying to understand what had just happened. My first thought was that I must have somehow missed it moving. Maybe it had quietly stood up and walked behind one of the trees. Maybe the snow and the shadows had made it difficult to see. Maybe it had simply slipped away while I wasn't looking. Those were all reasonable explanations, and honestly, I prefer those explanations. But there was something about the encounter that stayed with me. It wasn't just that I had seen a wolf. It was the way it had looked at me. I've seen wildlife before. I've seen animals watching people from a distance. There's usually some uncertainty in their behavior. They're cautious. They're curious. They're ready to run. This felt different. The wolf seemed completely comfortable. It didn't seem threatened by me. It didn't seem nervous. It didn't even seem particularly interested in escaping. It simply watched. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it was studying me. The longer I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. This was deep northern British Columbia. The wilderness there is enormous. There are places where you can travel for hours without seeing another person. The forests are thick. The mountains are vast. Wildlife has plenty of room to live without ever needing to come close to humans. So why was this enormous wolf sitting 30 feet from the back deck of an oil camp? I don't know. Maybe the camp had attracted it. There was food around. There were smells coming from the kitchen. There were workers moving around every day. Maybe it had learned that humans meant food. Maybe it was simply curious. Maybe it had been watching the camp for a while. Maybe I wasn't the first person it had seen. And maybe it wasn't even unusual for wolves in that area to behave that way. I don't know enough about wolf behavior to say. All I know is what I experienced. I went outside for a cigarette. I felt something watching me. I looked up, and there was the biggest wolf I had ever seen, sitting between two trees less than 30 feet away. It stared directly into my eyes. I looked away for barely a moment, and it disappeared. I've thought about that moment many times since, especially the size of the animal. Maybe my perception was exaggerated by the circumstances. When you're surprised by something, your brain doesn't always measure things accurately. An animal can appear larger when you're frightened. Distance can be difficult to judge. A large wolf sitting upright could easily look much bigger than it actually was. That's probably part of it. But even allowing for that, it was still an enormous animal. Large enough that the first thing I thought when I saw it was that it looked almost like a person sitting there. That's what made the encounter so memorable. I've never forgotten the image. The snow falling slowly, the silent forest, the dark trees, and that massive wolf sitting between them, just watching me. There was no dramatic attack, no growling, no chase. Nothing jumped out of the forest. The wolf didn't charge. It didn't even stand up. That's probably why the encounter stayed with me. Sometimes the scariest experiences aren't the ones where something actually happens. They're the ones where you realize something could happen, and then nothing does. You spend the rest of your life wondering what might have happened if things had been slightly different. What if I'd walked closer? What if the wolf had been hungry? What if there had been a pack nearby? What if I'd stayed outside longer? What if I hadn't looked away? That last question always makes me laugh a little. Because if I hadn't looked away, maybe I would have watched it disappear. Maybe I would have seen exactly where it went. Or maybe it would have remained there, staring at me. I don't know. And honestly, I'm glad I didn't find out. Looking back, the whole thing almost felt like an unspoken conversation. I was standing there thinking, okay, I see you. And the wolf seemed to answer, yeah, I see you too. Then there was another thought. I could eat you. And somehow, the strangest part is that I didn't feel like it was threatening me. It almost felt like the wolf knew it could hurt me if it wanted to, but had no reason to. It was almost like it was saying, I know you're here. I know what you are. I could probably eat you if I really wanted to, but I'm not going to. Then it simply disappeared. Okay, bye. That's honestly the best way I can describe the feeling. It sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. But standing there in that moment, it didn't feel ridiculous at all. It felt incredibly real. I've worked in remote places long enough to know that the wilderness can make you feel small. You can spend days around machinery, buildings, vehicles, generators, and other people, and start forgetting how enormous the natural world really is. Then, something like this happens. Suddenly, you're reminded. You're standing in a place where animals live. Not in a zoo, not behind a fence, not on a wildlife documentary. In their world. And for a few seconds, you happen to cross paths. That wolf didn't need to attack me to make its presence clear. It didn't need to make a sound. It didn't need to come any closer. It simply looked at me. And somehow, that was enough. I eventually finished my cigarette and went back inside. I'm sure I looked completely normal when I walked back into the camp. I probably didn't even tell anyone immediately. What would I have said? Hey guys, I just saw a giant wolf staring at me from the trees. They might have laughed. And I wouldn't blame them. It sounds like the kind of story that gets exaggerated every time it's retold. But I know what I saw. I know where it was. I know how close it was. And I know how enormous it looked. Most of all, I remember those eyes. That's the detail I haven't forgotten. Even now, years later, if I think about that winter afternoon, I can picture it clearly. The wolf sitting there, completely still, snow falling around it, its eyes fixed on mine. No fear, no panic. Just awareness. Like it had noticed me long before I noticed it. Maybe it was simply a wild animal that happened to wander near the camp. Maybe it had been curious about the smells and sounds coming from the buildings. Maybe it had spent years living around that wilderness and had learned that humans weren't always a threat. Maybe I just happened to catch it during a quiet moment. There are plenty of normal explanations. And that's probably what happened. But every now and then, I still think about that afternoon and wonder what it was doing there. Because when you're 30 feet away from an animal that looks almost as tall as a person while sitting down, and that animal is staring directly at you, your brain doesn't immediately start thinking about biology. It starts thinking about survival. You become aware of the distance. You become aware of the trees. You become aware of how quickly that animal could move. You become aware of how completely alone you are. And for a few seconds, you understand something that people living in cities rarely have to think about. Out there, you're not always the one watching. Sometimes, you're the one being watched. I never saw that wolf again. I never found tracks that I could confidently say belonged to it. I never discovered where it went, and I never found out whether anyone else at the camp had seen it. Maybe it continued living in those forests long after I left. Maybe it still passes through that area when the camp gets quiet and the snow starts falling. Maybe someone else will eventually step onto that same back deck for a cigarette, look toward the tree line, and feel that strange sensation that something is watching them. They'll look up, and between two trees, they'll see exactly what I saw. A massive wolf, sitting perfectly still, watching, waiting, and if they're lucky, they'll look away for just a second. When they look back, it'll be gone. The house I live in has been in my family for generations. My great-grandfather built it, and from that point on, it became the kind of place that people simply grew up in, lived in, and eventually passed down to the next generation. It has never really been just a house to my family. It's the family home. There are memories everywhere. People have grown up here. People have gotten married here. People have celebrated birthdays and holidays here. And, unfortunately, people have also died here. 2 people in particular passed away inside this house. My great-grandfather was one of them. My aunt was the other. Both of them eventually died from complications related to stomach cancer. There is one detail about my aunt that becomes important to this story. She used a lot of baby powder. A lot. She liked smelling clean and pleasant, and the baby powder became part of her routine. As her cancer became worse, she started relying on it even more. Her condition eventually affected her ability to control her bowel movements, which was obviously humiliating and difficult for her. The baby powder became even more important to her during that period. It helped her feel a little more comfortable. It helped cover the unpleasant smells. And eventually, the smell of baby powder became something my family strongly associated with her. After she died, that smell didn't completely disappear. Every once in a while, someone in the house would suddenly notice it. There wouldn't be any obvious source. No freshly opened container. No one using baby powder. Nothing that should have caused the smell. It would simply appear. Then it would disappear. At first, nobody thought much of it. Old houses have strange smells. Different rooms can hold odors for years. Air moves through walls and vents. Someone might have used the product earlier and forgotten about it. There were plenty of normal explanations, but the smell kept returning. Eventually, it became frequent enough that my family started paying attention. Then, it became almost a running joke. Someone would suddenly stop and say, "Do you smell baby powder?" Someone else would answer, "Yep," and that would be it. We'd laugh and continue whatever we were doing. Over time, we even started keeping track of it. We put a whiteboard up and began recording how many days passed between incidents. It sounds ridiculous when I say that out loud. But that's what it became. A strange little family tradition. We weren't sitting around terrified every time it happened. Most of the time, it was just something weird about the house. At one point, we had gone 49 days without anyone noticing the smell. That was our current streak. 49 days. Then one night, I had some friends over for a game night. It was nothing unusual. Just a group of people hanging out, playing games, talking, eating, and enjoying themselves. One of my friends was a guy I'll call Bill. There was nothing strange about the evening. Nobody was talking about ghosts. Nobody was trying to scare anyone. Nobody was investigating the house. It was just a normal night with friends. We played for a couple of hours. People were joking around. The house felt completely ordinary. Then, at some point during the evening, Bill suddenly stopped. He looked around. Then he asked, "Does anyone else smell baby powder?" That got everyone's attention. Not because the smell itself was unusual. We were used to it. But because it had been a while. Our 49-day streak was over. Someone probably laughed. Someone else may have made a joke about my aunt. For us, it was just another appearance of that familiar smell. Bill, however, didn't seem amused. He kept mentioning it. At first, I assumed he simply noticed it more strongly than everyone else. But as the evening continued, he became increasingly uncomfortable. The smell apparently started making him feel sick. We tried to ignore it and continue playing. After all, we'd smelled it before. It wasn't exactly a new experience. But eventually, Bill couldn't take it anymore. He excused himself and went to the bathroom. He told us the smell was making him feel sick. Nobody thought too much about it. We continued talking while he was gone. Then he came back. His expression was completely different. He looked shaken. He told us he'd been sick in the bathroom. Then he said something that immediately changed the mood of the entire room. There had been blood in his vomit. The game ended right there. Nobody cared about finishing. Nobody was joking anymore. His girlfriend, who was with us that night, took him to the emergency room. Suddenly, the strange smell didn't seem funny anymore. It wasn't something we were laughing about. We were worried about Bill. At the time, none of us knew what was happening. Seeing blood in someone's vomit is frightening enough on its own. There was no way to know whether it was something minor or something much more serious. So we waited. And eventually, we found out. A couple of weeks later, Bill was diagnosed with a malignant tumor in his stomach. Cancer, the same general area of the body affected by the cancer that had taken my great-grandfather and my aunt. Fortunately, there was some good news. The tumor was operable. Bill was able to receive treatment, and thankfully, things went well. He's been doing great. That's the part of the story I'm most grateful for. Whatever else anyone thinks about what happened that night, Bill survived. He's doing well. He's living his life. And that's what matters. But the timing still bothers me. Because of all the nights Bill could have visited my house, of all the possible evenings, he happened to be there on the night the baby powder smell returned after a 49-day absence. He happened to be the person who noticed it. He happened to become physically sick from the smell. He went to the bathroom, and he discovered blood in his vomit. Then, a couple of weeks later, doctors discovered a malignant tumor in his stomach. Maybe it's coincidence. Honestly, that's probably the simplest explanation. There are millions of coincidences in the world. People notice smells. People get sick. People are diagnosed with cancer. Sometimes those events happen close together simply because that's how probability works. The human brain is also extremely good at finding patterns. Once you know the history of the house, it's almost impossible not to connect the dots. We already associated baby powder with my aunt. We already knew she had died from complications related to stomach cancer. We already knew that the smell appeared occasionally for no obvious reason. Then Bill, completely unrelated to all of that, suddenly noticed the same smell and was later diagnosed with stomach cancer. Of course, our minds connected those events. But there's another detail that makes the story difficult to completely dismiss. Bill didn't know all of this when it happened. He wasn't sitting there thinking about my aunt. He wasn't trying to make the story fit. He simply noticed the smell. The smell made him sick. He went to the bathroom. And then he found blood. The diagnosis came later. That sequence is what makes the whole thing feel so strange. Bill and his now wife have their own opinion about it. They're pretty convinced the house is haunted. I can't really blame them if you experience something like that in someone else's house, knowing the history afterward. I imagine you'd have a hard time completely dismissing it. What's funny is that being convinced the house is haunted hasn't stopped them from coming back. They still come over for game night. They still hang out here. They still sit around, play games, eat, talk, and laugh. Apparently, a potentially haunted house isn't enough to ruin a good evening. We've even joked about what the baby powder means. Maybe my aunt is simply making herself known. Maybe the smell is her way of reminding us that she's still around. Maybe it's just an old house doing strange things. Or maybe there's something else going on that none of us understand. I don't claim to know. I've never seen an apparition in the house. I've never heard a voice. I've never watched an object move across a room. The baby powder is different. It's subtle. That's what makes it so interesting. There's no dramatic event attached to it most of the time. Someone simply notices the smell. That's it. Then eventually it disappears. Sometimes it might be days before it happens again. Sometimes much longer. And sometimes it happens when nobody expects it. We started keeping the whiteboard because the whole thing became so familiar. It turned something strange into something almost ordinary. Someone smells baby powder. We write down the date. The counter starts again. Then we wait. 49 days was our latest streak. And then Bill smelled it. That number has stuck with me, not because 49 is especially meaningful, but because it was long enough that we'd almost stopped thinking about the smell. Then, suddenly, it was back. And this time, it was connected to something much more serious. I've wondered what my aunt would have thought about all of this. She spent so much of her illness trying to maintain some sense of dignity. She used the baby powder because she wanted to smell pleasant. She wanted to feel clean. She wanted to make an uncomfortable situation a little easier. After she died, that smell became the thing everyone associated with her. It's almost strangely fitting if the smell really is connected to her somehow. She isn't appearing in a doorway. She isn't knocking on walls. She isn't screaming from another room. It's just the scent of something that was part of her life. Something ordinary. Something she used every day. And perhaps that's why nobody in my family has ever found the smell particularly frightening. It's actually comforting most of the time. The strange part was what happened with Bill, because it makes you wonder whether the smell was simply a memory or a warning. If it was a warning, what exactly was it warning us about? Was my aunt somehow aware that Bill was sick? Was she trying to alert him? Was the smell connected to his cancer? Or was everything simply a coincidence that happened to line up in a particularly disturbing way? There is no way to prove any of those ideas. Bill couldn't have known he had a tumor before that night. He hadn't been diagnosed. He hadn't been talking about cancer. As far as we knew, he was just another healthy person coming over to play games. Then, without warning, he became sick. And that sickness eventually led doctors to discover something potentially life-threatening. The fact that the tumor was operable was incredibly fortunate. In a strange way, you could even look at the entire thing from a completely different perspective. Maybe the smell wasn't something frightening at all. Maybe it was the reason Bill went to the bathroom. Maybe without feeling sick, he wouldn't have noticed the blood. Maybe without seeing the blood, he wouldn't have gone to the hospital when he did. Maybe the diagnosis came early enough because something, somehow, made him realize that something was wrong. I don't know if I believe that. But I can't completely rule it out either. And that's the part that gives the story its strange edge. If you believe in ghosts, you can look at what happened and see a warning from someone who had already died from the same disease. If you don't believe in ghosts, you can look at it as an incredible coincidence. Either way, Bill got medical attention. The tumor was found. It was operable. And he's doing well. That's the ending I care about most. Still, the house continues to be the house. It's still old. It's still full of family memories. People still live there. People still visit. And every now and then, someone stops in the middle of a conversation. They look around. Then they ask the question everyone in the family knows. Does anyone smell baby powder? When that happens, we usually laugh. Someone checks the whiteboard. The number goes back to 0. And everyone knows exactly what it means. The smell might disappear within minutes. It might last longer. Nobody knows when it will return. We don't leave anything out. We don't spray baby powder around the house. We don't try to recreate it. We simply notice it when it happens. And after what happened to Bill, I don't think anyone will ever forget that particular night. Because before that, the baby powder was just a strange thing that happened in an old family house. After that night, it became something else. Something we could never quite look at the same way again. Maybe my aunt was there. Maybe she wasn't. Maybe the house is haunted. Maybe it isn't. Maybe the smell is nothing more than an old scent trapped somewhere in the walls, appearing whenever the temperature, humidity, or airflow happens to be just right. That's the explanation I'd probably give someone who asked me to be rational about it. But then, I remember the timing. 49 days. A friend who had never experienced it before. A smell associated with a woman who died from stomach cancer. A sudden illness. Blood. A malignant stomach tumor. And, thankfully, a successful operation. I don't know what happened that night. Nobody does. But if the smell really was my aunt somehow making herself known, I like to think she wasn't there to scare anyone. Maybe she was simply reminding us that she was still around. And maybe, just once, she was trying to tell someone that something was wrong. Whatever the truth is, Bill and his wife still come over. They still play games. They still laugh about the strange things that happen in the house. And sometimes, when we're all sitting there together, someone will suddenly stop talking. Everyone looks around. Someone takes a slow breath. And then comes the question, do you smell baby powder? Nobody ever needs to explain what they're thinking. We all know. This happened another time when I was riding horses through a lower valley in the mountains. It was one of those places where you could spend hours outside and barely see another person. We were riding through the lower part of the mountains, following the valley and enjoying the ride. Nothing about the day seemed unusual. We were simply out on horseback, moving through the open land, taking in the scenery. The mountains surrounded the valley, and from where we were, the landscape felt enormous. It was the kind of place where you naturally became aware of things happening around you because there wasn't much else competing for your attention. Then we noticed an airplane. At first, that wasn't particularly strange. Planes fly over mountains all the time. There was nothing immediately alarming about seeing one in the sky. But then we realized it was flying very low. Much lower than we expected. It wasn't simply passing overhead and continuing on its way. It appeared to be flying back and forth across the valley. We watched it. Then it came back again and again. At that point, both of us were starting to wonder what exactly was going on. We were sitting on horseback, looking up at this aircraft as it repeatedly moved through the valley. Neither of us had any idea why it was flying so low. There was no obvious reason for it to be there. We just kept watching. Eventually, one of us said something along the lines of, "What the hell?" Because that was honestly the only reaction that made sense. The plane made another pass. We watched it move across the valley again. Then something happened that changed the entire situation. A large, square object suddenly dropped from the plane. We watched it fall. For a moment, neither of us seemed to know what we were looking at. It was a large, square shape. It wasn't something tiny that could easily be mistaken for a bird or a piece of debris. It was big enough and unusual enough that we immediately knew something had been dropped from the aircraft. And that was the moment when neither of us needed to say anything. We didn't discuss it. We didn't stand there trying to figure out what the object was. We didn't decide to ride closer and investigate. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. We simply reacted. We turned the horses around and headed home. Fast. There was no argument, no debate. No, let's go see what that was. No, maybe it's nothing. We both reached exactly the same conclusion at exactly the same time. We wanted to leave. The strange thing is that looking back, I still don't know why that particular moment scared us so much. We didn't know what was inside the object. We didn't know what it was supposed to do. We didn't even know whether it was dangerous. For all we knew, the plane could have been involved in some completely normal operation. The object could have been equipment. It could have been supplies. It could have been something being intentionally dropped into the valley for a perfectly ordinary reason. There are plenty of explanations. But when you're sitting on a horse in a remote mountain valley and an airplane starts repeatedly flying extremely low over you, then suddenly drops a large, square object into the landscape, your instincts don't necessarily wait for an explanation. You react first. And our reaction was simple. Get home? The horses seemed to understand that we weren't interested in hanging around. We turned around and started riding back. I don't remember us having some dramatic conversation about it. We didn't need one. The decision had already been made. We just wanted distance between ourselves and whatever had just happened. As we rode away, I couldn't stop thinking about the plane. Why was it flying so low? Why was it making repeated passes? Why did it need to fly back and forth through the valley? And most importantly, what exactly had it dropped? I kept thinking that maybe we'd understand if we waited. Maybe the object would open. Maybe something would come out. Maybe somebody would approach it. Maybe another aircraft would appear. But we weren't willing to find out. We kept going. The whole situation had happened so quickly. One moment we were simply riding through the mountains. The next we were watching an airplane behaving strangely. Then a large, square object fell from it. And suddenly, the peaceful ride had turned into something that felt completely wrong. That's what I remember most. The contrast. The valley had been peaceful. We were riding horses. It was a normal outdoor day. Then there was this aircraft. It wasn't just flying over us. It was flying low, back and forth, almost as if it was searching for something, or repeatedly approaching the same area. At the time, we couldn't tell what it was doing. We had no way of knowing whether it was military, private, agricultural, or something else entirely. We just knew it didn't look normal from where we were standing. Then came the object. A large, square thing dropping out of the plane. That was enough. We left. I sometimes think about what might have happened if we had stayed. Maybe nothing. Maybe the object would have landed harmlessly. Maybe someone would have come along and explained everything. Maybe we would have discovered that we had witnessed something completely ordinary. Maybe the plane was involved in some kind of delivery or training exercise. Maybe the object was supposed to be there. Maybe the whole thing had a simple explanation that we never learned. That's probably the most reasonable possibility. But there is another reason the memory has stayed with me. We didn't feel curious. We felt like we should leave. There's a difference. When you see something strange, curiosity usually takes over. You want to know what it is. You want to get closer. You want to watch. You want an explanation. That wasn't what happened here. Neither of us wanted to get closer. Neither of us wanted to wait. Neither of us even needed to convince the other person. We just turned around. That instinct is difficult to explain. Maybe it was simply common sense. We were in a remote area. We didn't know why an aircraft was flying unusually low. We didn't know what it had dropped. We had no idea who was operating it or what they were doing. Leaving was the safest decision. That's probably what any sensible person should have done. But when I think about the story now, there's something almost funny about how quickly we reacted. We had been out riding horses. We were probably relaxed, enjoying the mountains. Then we saw the plane. What the? Then the object dropped. And without saying much of anything, we were gone. The horses were heading home. We weren't interested in being witnesses to whatever came next. I still don't know what happened to the object. I never found out where it landed. I don't know whether it remained there or whether someone came and retrieved it. I don't know whether the plane continued flying through the valley after we left. I don't know if anybody else saw it. I don't even know whether the aircraft was actually doing something unusual. All I have is what we saw. A plane. Very low. Flying back and forth. Then a large square object dropped from it. And two people on horseback deciding immediately that they had seen enough. That's the entire incident. But sometimes a short experience can stay in your mind for years because there is no ending. There was no explanation. No news report afterward. No person telling us what the object was. No one coming to the house and saying, "Oh, you saw that? That's nothing. We were just dropping equipment." Nothing. The event simply ended when we rode away. And because there was no answer, the questions remained. What was that plane doing? Why was it flying so low? Why was it making repeated passes? What was inside that large square object? Was it intentionally dropped? Where did it land? And why did the whole situation feel wrong enough that neither of us even considered going closer? I have thought about those questions many times. Sometimes I wonder whether the distance made everything seem more mysterious than it really was. When you're looking at an aircraft from the ground, especially in a huge mountain valley, judging distance and altitude isn't always easy. Something can look extremely low when it's actually much higher. An object can look enormous because there is nothing nearby to give you a sense of scale. The mountains themselves can distort your perception of how high or low something is. So maybe the plane wasn't as low as we thought. Maybe the object wasn't as large as it appeared. Maybe everything had a perfectly normal explanation. That's possible. But even if that's true, it doesn't change the experience. We saw something unexpected. We didn't understand it. And we chose to leave. There is something about being in a remote place that makes you think differently. In a city, if something strange happens, there are usually people nearby. There are roads, buildings, police, businesses, cell service, other witnesses. You have options. In a mountain valley, those options can disappear. If something goes wrong, you can't simply walk down the street and ask someone what happened. You're responsible for yourself. You're responsible for whoever is with you. And when you're on horseback in a remote area, you become very aware of that. You don't know who is operating the aircraft. You don't know what they're dropping. You don't know whether they're aware you're there. You don't know whether whatever they're doing has anything to do with you. So when something unexpected happens, the safest choice can be to create distance. That's what we did, and I have never regretted it. Sometimes people tell stories like this and wonder why the people involved didn't investigate. Why didn't they get closer? Why didn't they take pictures? Why didn't they wait? Why didn't they see what happened? But that's easy to say afterward. When you're actually standing there and something doesn't feel right, your priorities can change very quickly. You don't always think, this would make an excellent story later. You think, I don't want to be here when whatever happens next happens. That's exactly how it felt. We didn't know what we were looking at, and we weren't willing to find out. The image that stayed with me is the moment the object dropped. The plane was making another low pass. We were watching it. Then suddenly, something separated from it. A large square shape. It began falling toward the valley. For a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down. We watched it descend. Neither of us knew what it was. Then the decision was made. We were leaving. No discussion. No plan. Just movement. We turned the horses around and headed home. I don't remember looking back much. I think part of me didn't want to know what happened after we left. Maybe that's why the memory feels unfinished. Because it is. We left before the story had an ending. We never found out what the object was. We never learned why the plane was there. We never learned whether the pilot knew anyone was watching. We never discovered whether there was something waiting for us in that valley. Maybe there was nothing. Maybe there was a completely ordinary explanation. Maybe someone else could look at the same event and immediately recognize what was happening. But for us, standing there on horseback, it was simply strange. And strange things become much more intimidating when you're far from everything. The mountains were still there, the valley was still there, the horses were still beneath us. But after that object dropped, the entire landscape felt different. We weren't looking at it as a peaceful place anymore. We were looking at it as a place where something unexpected had just happened, and we wanted out. I've sometimes wondered what I would do if I saw the same thing today. Would I still leave immediately? Probably. Maybe I'd have a phone. Maybe I'd record the aircraft. Maybe I'd take photographs. Maybe I'd try to identify the plane afterward. Technology might make the experience easier to investigate. But if the same thing happened in the same kind of remote location, I think my first reaction would still be the same. Get away. Figure it out later. Because you don't need to know exactly what something is to recognize that you don't want to be close to it. That's probably the biggest lesson I took from the experience. Not every mystery needs to be solved in the moment. Sometimes the safest response to something unexplained is simply to leave it alone. We never learned what was inside that square object. Maybe it was harmless. Maybe it was important. Maybe it was part of some operation that had nothing to do with us. Maybe it was something completely ordinary. But whatever it was, we weren't going to stick around to find out. And honestly, I'm still glad we didn't. Because every time I remember that day, I can still see the same scene. Two people on horseback in a mountain valley. The sun hanging over the landscape. An airplane flying strangely low overhead. Back and forth. Back and forth. Then, without warning, a large square object drops from the aircraft. For a moment, we just stare. Then we look at each other. Neither of us says a word. We turn our horses around, and we ride. Fast. We never found out what happened next. Maybe that's for the best. Some things are probably better left as questions. Because if we had stayed that day, we might have gotten an answer. And I'm not sure we would have liked it. This happened at the same remote camp in northern British Columbia where I once saw the enormous wolf standing at the edge of the forest. Working at a remote camp meant getting used to wildlife. You learned pretty quickly that the wilderness didn't care how comfortable you felt. There were animals everywhere. Most of the time, you never saw them. You just noticed the signs. Tracks in the snow, sounds somewhere beyond the tree line, something moving through the bushes when you were walking between buildings. After a while, you started treating those things as part of the job. But every once in a while, you got a much more direct reminder that you were living in the middle of the wilderness. One day, I had to take a bag of garbage out to the dumpster. Nothing unusual. It was a normal chore. I grabbed the bag, walked outside, and headed toward the dumpster. I wasn't expecting anything. I certainly wasn't expecting a bear. The camp was quiet. I reached the dumpster, lifted the lid, and tossed the garbage inside. Then I heard something. At first, I didn't understand what was happening. The entire dumpster moved, not a little. It started shaking violently. The metal container suddenly rocked back and forth, like something massive was throwing its weight around inside it. For a second, my brain couldn't make sense of it. I just stood there, staring. Then it hit me. There was something inside the dumpster. Something big. Very big. And there was really only one animal that made sense. A bear. The realization hit me almost instantly. I had just thrown a bag of garbage into a dumpster, with a bear already inside. I didn't stick around to confirm it. I didn't wait to see its face. I didn't wonder what kind of bear it was. I didn't try to take a picture. I didn't even carefully back away. I fucking bolted. I ran. The only thing I could think about was getting away from that dumpster as quickly as possible. The animal inside was still moving the container behind me. I remember thinking how ridiculous the whole situation was. I'd walked outside expecting to perform one of the most boring chores imaginable. Take out the trash. Instead, I'd apparently thrown a bag of garbage directly onto a bear. And judging by the way that dumpster was moving, the bear was not happy about it. I don't know whether it had been sleeping in there, eating something, or simply looking for food. I also don't know whether it had been inside the dumpster when I walked up, or whether it had climbed inside earlier. All I know is that I didn't see it. That's what makes the memory so funny and terrifying at the same time. The entire time I was standing beside that dumpster, I had absolutely no idea that a huge wild animal was only a few feet away from me. I could have opened the lid. I could have leaned over. I could have looked inside. Instead, I tossed the garbage in and was about to walk away. Then the dumpster moved. That's all it took. One violent shake, and suddenly I was very aware of exactly where I was. Northern British Columbia. Remote wilderness. A camp surrounded by forest. And a bear that had apparently decided a dumpster was a pretty good place to look for dinner. I don't remember how long it took me to get back inside. Probably only seconds. When adrenaline hits, everything happens quickly. I just remember getting away from that dumpster and not looking back. Later, I couldn't help laughing about it. The wolf encounter had been completely different. That wolf had watched me from a distance. It had been calm, almost peaceful. This was the opposite. There was no mystery about what I needed to do. Get away from the bear. Immediately, that incident also taught me something important about remote camps. You can get used to the wilderness. You can become comfortable with the animals. You can learn their habits and start thinking you understand what to expect. But you should never become too comfortable. Because sometimes the animal isn't somewhere out in the forest. Sometimes it's inside the fucking dumpster you're standing next to. And sometimes you don't discover that until after you've already thrown your garbage on top of it. When I was a kid in the early 1980s, my parents owned a house that they rented out to other people. Every so often, when tenants moved out, we would have to go through the house and clean everything before the next people moved in. Usually it was nothing exciting. Old food left behind, trash in the closets, things forgotten in drawers, the normal stuff people leave behind when they move. But one particular cleanup is something I have never forgotten. We had just gotten rid of a set of tenants who hadn't exactly taken great care of the place. The house needed to be cleaned out, so my family was going through each room and making sure nothing had been left behind. I was still a kid at the time, but I was helping out. At one point, I ended up in the kitchen. I started checking the cupboards. I opened the doors one by one and looked inside to make sure they were empty. Most of them were. Then, I noticed something tucked way back in the corner of one of the upper shelves. It was a mason jar. It was sitting so far toward the back that I could barely reach it. I remember thinking that someone must have forgotten it. Since I was curious, I decided to grab it. I climbed onto the kitchen counter and stretched as far as I could. My fingers finally reached the jar. I pulled it toward me, carefully grabbed it, and climbed back down. At that point, I had no idea what was inside. I assumed it was probably some kind of old food, maybe something someone had preserved, maybe an old jar of vegetables, maybe something that had been sitting there for years. Then I looked through the glass and froze. There was a finger inside, a human finger. It was floating in a clear liquid. For a few seconds, I just stood there staring at it. I didn't understand what I was seeing. My brain kept trying to reject the obvious answer. It couldn't be a real finger. Maybe it was a fake. Maybe it was some kind of weird object. Maybe it was a piece of something that only looked like a finger. But the longer I looked at it, the more obvious it became. It looked like an actual human finger. It was suspended inside the clear liquid. I was a kid. I didn't know what to do with that information. I didn't scream. I didn't drop the jar. I didn't even run. I simply put it down on the kitchen counter. Then I walked out of the kitchen. I remember being strangely calm. Maybe my brain hadn't caught up with what I had just seen. I walked away from the counter and called out to my mother. "Mom, I found a finger." That's literally what I said. No dramatic explanation. No build-up. Just, "Mom, I found a finger." I don't remember exactly what happened immediately afterward, but obviously my parents came to investigate. And that's when the strange discovery became a family mystery. Because what the hell was a human finger doing inside a mason jar? And why was it hidden at the back of a kitchen cupboard? There are a lot of explanations for why someone might have a preserved biological specimen, but none of them are particularly comforting when you're a child and you've just found what appears to be a human finger in the kitchen. The jar itself made the whole thing even stranger. It wasn't sitting out somewhere obvious. It wasn't in a medical container. It wasn't labeled. It had simply been tucked away at the back of a cupboard, like someone had deliberately hidden it. I don't remember exactly what happened to the jar afterward. What I remember most clearly is the moment I looked through the glass and realized what was inside. Even now, decades later, I can still picture it. The clear liquid, the pale shape suspended inside, the unmistakable shape of a finger, and my completely matter-of-fact reaction. "Mom, I found a finger." Looking back, I honestly don't know why I wasn't more terrified. Maybe because I was too young to understand how disturbing the discovery actually was. Kids can have strange reactions to things adults would find horrifying. Maybe I thought it was just another weird thing someone had left behind. After all, we'd already found plenty of junk while cleaning the house. Old belongings, garbage, things people had forgotten. A jar wasn't unusual. It was what was inside the jar that was unusual and extremely disturbing. The more I think about it now, the stranger the whole situation becomes. Someone had placed that object inside the jar. They had filled the jar with liquid. They had sealed it. Then they had put it inside a kitchen cupboard. And somehow, nobody had noticed it. At least, nobody had noticed it until I did. It makes you wonder who it belonged to. Was it actually human? Was it a medical specimen? Was it something used for some strange hobby? Was it a prank? Was it preserved for some completely innocent reason that would have made perfect sense if we'd known the story? I honestly don't remember ever getting a satisfying explanation. Maybe my parents figured out what it was. Maybe they threw it away. Maybe they decided they didn't want to know. The details have faded over the years. But that first moment hasn't. I remember climbing onto the counter. I remember reaching toward the back of the shelf. I remember pulling the mason jar forward. And I remember looking inside. A finger, floating in clear liquid. That was enough. I put it down, walked out, and called for my mother. Sometimes I think about how strange that sentence must have sounded from a child's mouth. Mom, I found a finger. If someone had told me that story today, I would probably assume they were exaggerating. But I was there. I saw it. And for years afterward, whenever I opened an old cupboard or found a forgotten mason jar somewhere, I couldn't help remembering that day. The weirdest part wasn't even the finger itself. It was the fact that it was hidden so casually. It wasn't in some abandoned laboratory. It wasn't in a medical facility. It wasn't in a museum. It was in a kitchen cupboard, a place where someone could have reached for a plate, a glass, or a cooking pot without ever knowing what was sitting above them. That's what makes the memory so disturbing. It was ordinary. An ordinary kitchen, an ordinary cupboard, an ordinary mason jar, and something completely unexpected inside it. Even now, I have no idea why it was there. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation. Maybe someone had been studying anatomy. Maybe it was a preserved specimen. Maybe it was part of some old medical collection. Maybe the previous tenants had some bizarre hobby. Maybe it wasn't even a human finger. I was a child, after all. Memory can change over time. Something that looked horrifying to me then might have had a much simpler explanation. But I know what I remember. I pulled that jar from the back of the cupboard. I looked inside. And I saw what appeared to be a human finger floating in clear liquid. Then I put the jar down and walked out of the kitchen. No investigation. No screaming. No attempt to figure it out. Just one sentence to my mother. Mom, I found a finger. And honestly, I'm not sure there's a better way a kid could have handled it. Whatever was inside that jar, I didn't want to touch it again. I never did. And decades later, that mason jar is still one of the strangest things I have ever found hidden inside a house. And just like that, tonight's journey comes to an end. If you're still awake, thank you for spending these quiet hours with LURK. Wherever you're listening from tonight, I hope these stories gave you something to disappear into for a while, and maybe kept you company while the rest of the world slept. If you enjoyed tonight's stories, subscribe to LURK and come back tomorrow night. Your support helps us keep creating longer, darker, and more immersive horror stories for you. But for now, let the screen go dark. Let the room become quiet. Close your eyes and forget everything you heard tonight, at least until tomorrow, because some stories are easier to listen to in the dark, and some are better left there. Good night, sleep well, and whatever you hear after this, don't open your eyes.